Hey everyone, Luke here, and this week I got a fun little commission pet portrait for you. It's of this husky by the name of Echo. I'm going to take you through the entire painting process from the underpainting to the palette mixing all the way to the finished product. So without further ado, let's jump in. So we're going to start this painting right away by getting a underpainting with some raw umber. The whole idea behind this is to sort of reinforce some of the lighter and darker values, as well as give me sort of a roadmap to follow during the painting process. After establishing the underpainting, I'm going to start by mixing my palette. I've realized in my past videos I never really showed this a lot, and this is something I do quite a bit in the studio, which is pre-mix my palette before I actually start painting. The main reason for this is that because I'm in the studio and I'm in a controlled setting and I'm not worried about lighting changes or environment changes or anything like that, I can really take my time and plan out my palette how I want to tackle this piece. Now, the idea is not to mix every single color that's going to be on this painting. It's more or less to get the different color temperatures, the different color zones, and organize the values from darkest to lightest. So I start here with this mixing palette, which is where I'm going to mix up the majority of my paint, and then I'm going to transfer it over to my painting palette. Just creates for a cleaner workspace, as well as a little bit more of an organized palette. And here's the finished palette here. As you can see, all the darkest values at the bottom, all the lightest values at the top, and during the painting I'm going to jump between them to mix the correct color that I need for the certain area. So now we're going to get started with the most sensitive area, which is the eye. If you're new here, what I really like to do is start out with the most sensitive, high detail areas first. Essentially get the hardest part out of the way and done. Because this is a commissioned pet portrait and it's a portrait to begin with, one of the first things that's going to be looked at is the eyes. So I like to take my time, tackle them first, and make sure they're 100% correct. As I start moving outward from the eyes, I'll start to switch over to a bigger and bigger brush that's necessary for the zone. It's important for me and for my paintings to try and not get caught up in the detail, to try and let the brush do the majority of the work. So once I'm done with some of these sensitive areas, I'm going to try and get to the biggest brush appropriate for that area to get as much information down as possible with the least amount of brushwork. So because I paint alla prima, meaning wet into wet paint, you're going to see me bounce between painting the background and painting the dog. Now in this case, Echo has some fur that's flowing a little bit into the background. So in order to get this really smooth, soft transition between fur and background, I can take advantage of this alla prima technique where I sort of feather the fur into the background. So again, you'll see me bounce between painting backgrounds in some sections and painting the fur in other, because it's the only way for me to get that sort of soft transition. Now, in trying to keep some of the brushwork, my biggest tip is to use the least amount of brush strokes possible. You want to mix the majority of your paint off the canvas And then when you apply it on the canvas, try not to blend it too much with the surrounding colors, as you'll start to lose some of the brushwork and you might get some muddy colors in the process. So the main process that I use is back to front and dark to light. So in this situation right here, I wanted to paint the background first, paint all the darkest values, then paint the lighter values on top of that. Now around the eyes here, I'm being very cautious the way that I'm applying the paint. What I'm trying to do is create a sort of arc, as the eye sockets are a 3D form, and I'm trying to give the illusion that they have some sort of depth and some sort of structure to them. And one way to do that is sort of create this contour line with the way that you apply the paint. So going around the eye sockets here. This painting was done over the course of 2 sittings. So during this first sitting, I was really conscious with how much time I actually had in the studio. And this is something that's really important to take into account when you are painting alla prima, because you won't be able to achieve some of the smooth transitions unless both parts of the paint are wet. If I were to leave this dry and then come back a few days later, when I went to go feather some of the fur into the background or do some of the scratching out, it's going to have really rough, hard edges, and it's not going to have the same appeal as if I was just conscious with how much time I had in the studio and planned out my painting a little bit better. So this next technique that you're going to see coming up is called scratching out. And what I'm going to do is take my palette knife and literally scratch the paint out for where Echo's whiskers would be. Again, this is one of the techniques that I'm talking about that you can only really do when the painting is wet. If the painting is dry, you may not be able to scratch all the way through, as well as the palette knife won't glide as easily on the surface and you'll get a really choppy looking scratch out. But let's listen in, as I find the scratch out quite pleasing. As we start to get into some of the final parts of this portrait here, you're going to see a lot of different tones of white. White is a really difficult tone to paint because you almost want to just dump out a tube of titanium white and paint that on there. So one thing I can really suggest is make sure you get a color checker of some kind or some way of checking your values, and really pay attention to the subtle differences between where you can use almost a pure white or where it's almost a little bit more gray, a little bit more warm, or a little bit more cool, and create some more depth in your painting as opposed to just putting a flat white. And as we start to get to the end of the painting here, I put the final little details on the eyes to make this painting just pop out. And here we are, the finished painting. All in all, I had a ton of fun doing this painting. It was done over the course of 2 sittings, and I'm really pleased how it turned out. And the client enjoyed it too, which is of course the most important thing. So if you made it this far in the video, I'd really appreciate a like so more people can see this video. Consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification to get notified as soon as I drop a new video. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Take care.